The first shell slipped from her hand, clattering against the steel floor, a hollow sound that echoed like a warning through the cavernous hangar. The pilot's eyes snapped downward, catching the flash of ink beneath her rolled sleeve. Jagged, half-hidden, redacted lines burned into her skin. He froze, his breath stilled, as if the tattoo itself carried the weight of a ghost he had tried for years to forget. The room, until then alive with the restless hum of preparation, seemed suddenly emptied of air. She bent, picked up the shell with steady fingers, and placed it back into the belt for the Apache's 30mm chain gun, her movements precise, calm, indifferent to the silence her presence had summoned. Her name was Sergeant Elena Marquez, but in that moment, names felt irrelevant. She was simply a figure of quiet defiance, scarred but unbroken, her posture upright against the indifference of men who whispered her story behind her back but never to her face. The tattoo, a series of numbers, crossed out by thick bars of black, was not decoration but testimony. To those who knew, it was unmistakable. It was the mark of a unit that had been erased from official memory, a mission buried, its survivors scattered or silenced. And yet here she was, in the open, feeding steel into a beast of war, while the pilot above her hesitated, his hand trembling against the cockpit frame. It was not the weapon that unnerved him. It was her. The whispers began almost immediately. A young crew chief shifted uncomfortably, stealing glances, while another soldier avoided her gaze entirely. The pilot's jaw tightened, but his voice never came. She continued to work in silence, hands steady, gaze forward, offering no explanation, no apology. For years, she had carried both the ink and the silence, knowing the world would read into them what it wanted. Her silence had become her armor, her weapon, her final act of loyalty to those who could no longer speak. Elena had not always lived inside this wall of silence. Once she had been the loudest laugh in a desert convoy, the steady hand in the chaos of dust storms and ambushes. The smell of diesel and sand had been her second home, the thrum of rotor blades her song. She had believed, with the unshakable fire of youth, that the uniform on her back was a shield against injustice, that loyalty up and down the chain was a covenant no one would break. Then came the mission. No one was supposed to survive. The betrayal buried in classified reports. The faces of her brothers and sisters in arms scattered across the desert floor, marked forever in her memory by the stench of burning metal and the copper tang of blood. She had survived, yes, but survival was not victory. Survival was the long, cruel sentence of carrying their names in silence. When she returned home, the unit was gone from the records, their insignia erased, their commendations withheld, their story redacted. The tattoo had been her act of rebellion, her way of ensuring the truth could never be erased, not fully. Numbers inked, then blacked out, not by her choice but by a higher hand. An officer who warned her that the truth would destroy her if she ever spoke it. She had sworn no oath to silence, but she had lived it anyway, because the alternative was exile from the only family she had left, the Brotherhood of Uniform, fractured though it was. Now she stood in a hangar filled with men who respected machines more than memory, and yet her presence disturbed the air like a storm pressing against the walls. They could not unsee the tattoo, and he, the pilot, could not unfeel the weight of it. Still, she spoke nothing. Her silence was not submission, it was challenge. The pilot descended from the cockpit, boots hitting the floor with the heavy finality of a gavel. His face bore the hard lines of someone accustomed to authority, but his eyes betrayed unease. He moved closer, studying the ink as though it were an accusation carved into her skin. He opened his mouth, then closed it, words catching like shards of glass in his throat. Others waited, watching, complicit in their silence, unwilling to defend her, unwilling to confront him. The injustice was palpable, not in shouted insults or blatant hostility, but in the way no one stood beside her. Silence was its own kind of cruelty, heavier than ridicule, sharper than reprimand. She knew it well, yet Elena did not waver. She loaded another shell. The belt grew longer, heavier, until it curled like a serpent at her feet. She stood over it, shoulders squared, a sentinel beside the very weapon that gave men like him their power. Inside the pilot's mind, memory warred with duty. He had seen that tattoo before, Once, long ago, in a briefing he was ordered to forget. A list of names, redacted, casualties officially attributed to mechanical failure. He remembered the rumors, whispers of betrayal, orders that made no sense. And now, standing before him, was a survivor branded with that erasure, as real and unyielding as the steel beneath his boots. He had two choices: to enforce the silence that command demanded, or to honor the unspoken truth carved into her flesh. The others pretended not to notice, but tension thickened in the hangar. Every soldier present knew the dynamic. Authority rested with the pilot, rank pinned on his chest. Eleanor's strength was her silence, unyielding, defiant, impossible to erase. The clash was inevitable. Though neither raised their voice, neither made a move. The weight of history pressed between them, demanding resolution. She finished the belt. Her hands, calloused and scarred, rested lightly on the ammunition, as if laying flowers on a grave. Only then did she lift her gaze to him. It was not challenge, not plea, but something more devastating. Recognition. Recognition of the cowardice of silence. Recognition of the burden of memory. Recognition of the truth they both carried, though one had tried to bury it. The pilot's lips parted. The words came low, almost a whisper, yet in the silence of the hangar they cut sharper than any command. He said what he had never said before, what none of them had dared to acknowledge aloud, that the dead had not been forgotten, that erasure could not erase sacrifice. That silence was not compliance. It was survival, and in that moment authority shifted, not through confrontation, but through admission. The soldiers who had watched in silence stood straighter. A ripple of respect spread across the hangar, unspoken but undeniable. The tattoo that had once marked her as dangerous now marked her as untouchable. For the first time in years, Elena's silence was met not with suspicion but with reverence. She did not gloat, did not smirk, did not soften. She remained still, her power rooted not in victory but in truth. The pilot bowed his head, just slightly, enough to signal that he understood what the others now saw, that she had carried more than her weight, more than her silence, more than her grief. She had carried them all, even those too afraid to remember. Later, when the Apache lifted into the sky, its chain gun fed by the shells she had loaded, every man in the hangar carried the image of her standing beside it, unbroken. They whispered her name with reverence, though she never asked them to. They told her story in fragments, careful not to betray details, but always ending the same way, with the image of a woman whose silence was louder than any order, whose inked skin spoke truths entire reports had buried. One of them repeated her words, few as they were, spoken at the very end. When the pilot had finally acknowledged her, the names they erased still burn, and as long as we carry them, silence is not defeat. Silence is remembrance. Those words traveled beyond the hangar, beyond the base, into barracks and mess halls and quiet corners where soldiers told stories that kept them human. And so, when others saw her tattoo, they no longer looked away. They looked closer. They nodded, sometimes in silence, sometimes in salute. The power had shifted. Not in an instant, not in fanfare, but in the quiet recognition of unshakable honor. The story would spread beyond the military, whispered into families, shared across generations. Civilians who never wore the uniform would hear it and understand. For sacrifice needs no translation. They would feel pride and sorrow and the sting of injustice and the relief of resolution. They would know her silence was not weakness, but the strongest act of all. And when her shift ended, Eleanor Marquez walked out of the hangar as she had entered. Head high, shoulders back, alone but never lonely. For the ghosts who had walked with her through the years walked still, their presence etched into every line of her tattoo, every breath she drew. She needed no validation, no apology. The respect of the living mattered less than the memory of the dead. Yet in that single moment, she had been seen, and that was enough. Her story is a reminder that honor is not always shouted, not always draped in medals or carved into stone. Sometimes it is inked in hidden places, carried in silence, and revealed only when the world is finally ready to listen. And now, if her silence has spoken to you, let it live beyond this story. Tell us where you are hearing it from. Share what it stirs in you, and stand with those who carry unseen battles in silence. For the quietest among us often hold the loudest truth. And if you wish to hear more stories of such unshakable dignity, stay, subscribe, and remember, the names erased are never truly gone, not as long as we remember them.